Somehow, despite Mr. Monroe's bumbling and Chester's mumbling, we managed to get on our way by about 4 o'clock that afternoon. I know the time because that's when my stomach alarm goes off to remind me that I have 2 hours until my next meal. In case I get distracted, a second alarm goes off around 5 so I can begin panicking. That day, however, I decided to start my panicking a little early. On a camping trip, I had no idea when I'd be fed. As it turned out, I didn't have to worry about that, but my panicking wasn't in vain. It was good practice for everything that happened later. I also needn't have worried about ticks and mosquitoes, because by the time we'd driven to the other side of the lake and were finally out in the woods, I'd been covered with so much spray that only bugs wearing gas masks could have gotten through. Howie, Chester, and I kept our distance from one another and the rest of the Monroes. It was hard to avoid the smell, though. In fact, I half expected the entire family to be picked up at any minute on charges of polluting the air. "I don't think anybody has ever been this way before," Pete shouted out. "A comforting thought," I heard Chester mutter. I knew what Pete was saying wasn't so, but I didn't mention it then. I may not have done a lot of tracking in my life, but I knew enough to tell that someone had been this way before, and not so long before either. "Don't worry, son," Mr. Monroe shouted back. "I'm not worried, Dad. I think it's cool. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll get lost and I can save us." "I have a compass," Toby said. "I have a compass and a map," Pete said, "and if anybody chokes, I can do the Heimlich maneuver." "I hope that isn't a requirement for one of your badges," Mr. Monroe said. Personally, I took Pete's remark as a hopeful one. You have to eat before you can choke, after all. Howie, meanwhile, didn't seem to have a worry in the world. He was sniffing the air happily, ignoring the stench of insect repellent for the more delicious and inviting aromas in the air. "Smell those pine trees," he cried. "Smell those wildflowers. Smell that smoke." "Smoke?" Suddenly, Mrs. Monroe, who with Toby was in the lead, stopped in her tracks and pointed. "Look," she called back to her husband. Pete and Mr. Monroe ran to catch up with the others. The three of us were quick to follow. "Someone's camping over there by the lake," Mrs. Monroe said. "They already have a fire going. I think we should head in that direction." "Oh, Mom," Pete said, "we don't want to make camp near somebody else. The whole idea of this is to go it alone." "No, the whole idea is to get through the night. So far, no one," and she glanced at her husband's bandaged hand, "has demonstrated a reassuring flair for survival." "We have Pete's books," Mr. Monroe said tentatively. "Better than that," said their oldest son. "You have Pete." "You haven't earned that merit badge yet," said Mrs. Monroe. "Look, I don't want to argue about this. If no one else were around, I would say let's just pitch our tent wherever we end up. But the point is, there is someone else around, and I'll bet you they know a lot more about camping than we do." Pete and Toby looked to their father. "Your mother is right," he said. "It can't hurt to have somebody nearby." "It can if that somebody is a homicidal maniac," Chester whispered to me. "Shh," I said, not wanting Howie to overhear. Howie, however, had already run on ahead of us, sniffing at the ground as he went. When we caught up with him, he asked, "Is this how you track, Uncle Harold? Am I doing it right?" "That's right," I said. "Just put your nose to the ground and follow it." "Makes sense to me," he said with a chuckle. "Get it, Uncle Harold? Get it, Pop? Makes sense to me." I chuckled back. Chester just rolled his eyes and commented, "Let's hope you'll still be laughing by midnight, Harold." Behind us, the Monroes were singing as they walked. It was a silly song about a bunny rabbit, one I hadn't heard in a long time, and it got me thinking about Toby and Pete when they were little. But then, as I listened to the words, I started thinking about someone else. "It's too bad," I remarked to Chester, "that Bunnicula couldn't have come camping with us. He always gets left out of these adventures that we have." "Yeah," Howie said, "just because he's a rabbit, I don't see why he has to stay home in his cage all the time." "Rabbits don't understand camping trips," Chester said. "If Bunnicula were here, he'd go brainlessly hopping this way and that, and the next thing you know, he'd be lost." "That would be terrible," Howie said sadly. "Darn right it would," said Chester. "Can you just imagine him lost in the woods? I can see the headlines now. Evergreen Forest turns white." "Here we go again," I said. "Besides, a vampire rabbit," Chester went on, "is the last thing we need with us on St. George's Day." "St. George's Day?" Howie asked. "What's that?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "Stop protecting the kid," Chester said. And then, before I could say another word, he told Howie all about the evil spirits in the woods and midnight. Howie's eyes grew larger and larger. "I want to go home," he whimpered when Chester was through. "Howie," I said, "Chester is telling stories out of books. Nothing like that is going to happen here. There's no evil in these woods. There is nothing to be scared of." "Oh, really?" said Chester, coming to a sudden halt. Straight ahead of us, not 10 feet away, were 2 men and a dog. One man was frying some fish over an open fire. I couldn't see his face, but his hands made me think of spiders. The hairs rose a little along the back of my neck. They rose even higher when I glanced at the other man sitting on a rock nearby. His head was the shape of a potato, all lumpy and swollen. His right eye twitched, and in his hands he held a large knife. He wasn't doing anything with it, just holding it. From time to time he'd turn it over, and then spit on the ground. The dog, also potato-like, sat by his feet. He didn't look as if he had the energy to spit. A long ribbon of drool hung from his lower lip, as much a part of him as the scar that ran across his jowl. When the Monroes arrived right after us, the man by the fire looked up. "Well, howdy," he said. "You folks out camping?" "Well, we thought we'd camp over there," Mrs. Monroe said, pointing to a sandy patch near the water's edge. "That is, if you don't mind." "Mind? Heck no. We never do get to see people in these parts. I'm Bud, and that there is Spud." Spud, I thought. How fitting. The Monroes introduced themselves and us. Spud looked everybody over, turned the knife in his hands, and spat on the ground. "Nice-looking animals you got there," Bud said, wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. "Yes'm, nice-looking. Now you take Dawg. He's seen better days. He can't help it. He's been kicked around by life, and sometimes he just gets downright mean and ornery. But he's a good dog. Dawg is." "That's your dog's name?" said Mr. Monroe. "Dawg?" "Dawg," said Bud. He flipped the fish in the frying pan. Spud spat. Dawg dragged himself to his feet and, drool and all, headed in our direction. "He looks a little like Max," I commented, trying to cheer myself by bringing to mind a friendly bulldog of our acquaintance. "Yeah, the way a rattler looks like a garter snake. Happy St. George's Day," Chester said, and the hairs continued to rise all the way down my back. "What kind of mutt do you call yourself?" Dawg growled as he came closer. His teeth were stained and pitted like old linoleum. "Nonviolent?" I said, hoping he wouldn't catch the tremor in my voice. He snorted, sending a waft of rancid breath my way, and started to circle me, sniffing. If there's one thing I can't stand, it's this humiliating sniffing routine that passes for a handshake in the dog world. I would have suggested that he give me 5, but I was a little too nervous. Besides, I didn't have the feeling Dawg was the kind of old dog that was keen to learn new tricks. In fact, I didn't have the feeling Dawg was too keen at all. "Watch this," he said, when he tired of sniffing. He sauntered over to the campfire, stopping only when he was so close that his mangy fur took on a red glow. I exchanged puzzled glances with Chester and Howie, wondering what it was that we were supposed to be watching. The Monroes, meanwhile, had moved down the slope to their campsite. Bud, who had gone back to his fish, ignored Dawg, while Spud just stared off into space, slowly turning his knife in his hands. After a moment, Dawg barked. The two men looked up and Bud started to shout, "Looky, Spud! Hot dog! Hot dog!" His wild laughter made him sound like a demented goose. From the way Dawg and Spud curled their lips, I gathered this was meant to be a big joke. Suddenly, I had the feeling I knew how prehistoric cavemen might have entertained themselves, and I decided maybe television wasn't such a bad invention after all. "Gee, Uncle Harold," Howie said, "what do you think?" "I think Chester's right," I replied. "The woods are full of spirits tonight." "Evil spirits?" "Stupid spirits," I said. Chester mumbled something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of the can opener in the distance. Dinner was about to be served, and I wasn't going to miss it. After I had eaten, while Toby and Pete and Mr. Monroe renewed their attempts at keeping the family's improvised tent upright, I joined Howie and Chester for a stroll along the lake's edge. "This isn't so bad, is it, Chester?" I said. "It's a beautiful night. The moon will be out soon." "It's a full moon tonight," Chester commented. "I'm full too," said Howie. "Listen to the water lapping the shore," I suggested. "Watch where you step," Chester countered. "You never know what's been washed up." "The trouble with you, Chester, is that you've lost your capacity to enjoy the simple things in life." "That isn't true," Chester replied. "I enjoy you." "Thank you," I sighed deeply. "The world is full of wonder," I said. I often get philosophical after meals. "Behold its majesty. Marvel at its creatures, both great and small." "Not to mention weird," said Chester. He nodded toward a figure sitting on its haunches several yards ahead of us. I could tell from the potato-like silhouette that it was Dawg. He was looking out at the horizon, waiting for sunset, perhaps, or dreaming of sunsets past. When we approached, he shared his thoughts with us. "You could spit till you're dry," he said, "and never make a lake." Chester hissed, a cat's way of booing. "You come here often?" I asked Dawg, hoping to compensate for Chester's lack of good manners. "Geez," Chester said under his breath, "why don't you ask him his sign?" "Not so often," said Dawg, apparently oblivious to Chester's rude remark. "Bud and Spud, they don't get out much." "Well," Chester said, loudly enough for Dawg to hear this time, "it was certainly nice of the warden to let them out for St. George's Day." There was a glimmer in Dawg's eyes. Of a pretty low wattage, mind you, but a glimmer none the less. St. George's Day, he said. Funny you should mention that. Funny, said Chester. What strikes you as funny? Just before we came here, Bud said something about it being a special day soon. He said... The glimmer faded, and I wondered how long we'd have to wait for the bulb to be changed. He said? I prompted hopefully. He said, Dawg went on, that this was the night to find it. Find it? Howie squealed. He was beginning to shiver a little, as the wind coming off the lake turned colder. I felt a chill go through me, too. Find what? I don't know, said Dawg. He didn't say. But I do know one thing. Bud'll find it, and Spud'll know what to do with it. A sudden phew and thunk grabbed our attention. In the distance, Spud walked to a tree and pulled his knife from where it had lodged. Oh yeah, Dawg said. Spud'll know what to do, all right.